11 years ago, a young architect named Hana Sasaki vanished without a trace. Her car disappeared, her project stolen, her dreams erased. The case went cold, buried beneath silence and power, until one retired detective uncovered a secret that had been hidden in plain sight, inside the very building that made her killer a legend. What they found beneath the Aegis Tower would shatter reputations, expose a billion-dollar empire built on murder, and finally bring justice to a woman the world had forgotten. Before we dive into this incredible true story of betrayal, genius, and redemption, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where truth finally breaks through the concrete. On a biting October morning in 2006, the metallic rattle of a storage unit door broke through the monotone rhythm of an auctioneer's voice. Jarek Oles, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a gambler's heart, stood near the back of the crowd at a self-storage facility on the industrial edge of Columbus, Ohio. The cold bit through his canvas jacket, but his eyes were sharp, scanning for the glint of opportunity. He wasn't here for forgotten furniture or dusty keepsakes. He was hunting for treasure in metal form, parts, engines, maybe even something rarer if luck decided to smile. Jarek's garage, Alice Vintage, had been hanging by a thread. His love for classic European cars, especially Volkswagens, was noble, but not particularly profitable in a town where dreams were often traded for practicality. Still, he believed that sometimes, buried among the forgotten remnants of strangers' lives, there was a story worth resurrecting. When the auctioneer, Barry, a stout man with a voice like gravel, cut the lock on Unit 418, the snap echoed through the cold air like a starter's pistol. The crowd leaned forward as the door groaned open, revealing a darkness thick with dust. Inside lay the detritus of an abandoned life. A laminate dresser, moldy carpet, a few unmarked boxes, and the sour smell of mildew. Nothing that hinted at profit. But Jarek's eyes caught on something at the back. A hulking shape beneath a heavy canvas tarp, its curves too precise to be junk. His pulse kicked. He knew that silhouette. The bidding was half-hearted, starting at 50 and crawling to 100. Jarek hesitated, counting the last few bills in his pocket, his final gamble before rent came due. Then instinct took over. 150, he called out. A reseller countered with 200, but Jarek didn't flinch. 300, he said, the words burning with conviction. The reseller backed off. Sold, Barry barked, and just like that, the unit, and whatever mystery it held, belonged to Jarek Oles. An hour later, the crowd was gone, and the air was still. Jarek returned with his truck, unlocked the door, and began to clear the debris piece by piece. Here, Doug, the thicker the dust became, carrying the stale scent of time long sealed away. Finally, he stood before the tarp. His breath quickened as he pulled. The canvas resisted, then gave way with a harsh rip. Light cut through the gloom, revealing a car cloaked in turquoise and decay. A Volkswagen Beetle, late 60s or early 70s. Its paint was faded, its tires collapsed, but its form was unmistakable. A relic of joy and freedom that had somehow ended up in this tomb of concrete and dust. The driver's door hung slightly open, as if waiting for someone who never returned. Jarek's heart pounded. This could be the miracle that saved his garage. Even in rough condition, the parts alone could fetch thousands. But when he wiped away the grime from the windshield and copied the vehicle identification number, a strange chill crept up his spine. Back in his truck, he dialed Darlene, a friend at the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, who often ran checks for him. "Darlene, it's Jarek," he said, voice tight with excitement. "How are you doing, honey?" she replied, her laugh weary. "I'm freezing, and the coffee machine's broken again. What have you got for me this time?" Jarek hesitated, glancing toward the shadowed unit where the Beetle waited. "A vintage VW," he said slowly. Looks like it's been missing a long time. He had no idea that what he'd just uncovered wasn't a restoration project. It was the beginning of a story that had been buried for over a decade, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door. "Darlene, I need you to run a VIN for me," Jarek said, balancing his notepad on the steering wheel. "Just bought a storage unit, found a classic Beetle. Thought it might be my lucky day." He read the numbers aloud, listening as Darlene's fingers tapped across her keyboard. A minute passed, then another. The silence on the other end stretched, uneasy. "Darlene? Everything okay?" When she spoke again, her voice was tighter, lower. "Jarek, where did you find this car?" "Storage auction, Unit 418, Commerce Drive facility." "Why?" The pause before her answer felt endless. "It's not listed as stolen," she said finally, "but it's flagged, heavily flagged, in the national database." Jarek frowned. "Flagged for what?" "It's tied to a missing person case, a high-profile one, from the 90s. Hana Sasaki." The name hung in the air like a ghost. "Jarek," Darlene continued, "the system says to notify the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation immediately. Don't touch anything. Don't move the car. Don't even close the door." Her tone left no room for argument. "The police are going to call you soon." Jarek hung up, his pulse hammering. The excitement that had fueled him now twisted into cold dread. As he walked back toward Unit 418, the turquoise Beetle didn't look like a treasure anymore. It looked like a tomb through the dusty window. The darkness inside felt alive, watchful. He stood in the silent corridor, wind whipping through the narrow lanes of storage doors, waiting for the sound of sirens. Across town, Detective Elias Vance was pretending to care about the slide presentation titled "Maximizing Your Deferred Compensation." Retirement seminars were supposed to be a light at the end of the tunnel, but to him, it felt like a lecture on how to fade quietly. 30 years on the job had taken its toll. 3 decades of blood, lies, and broken families. Cold cases were meant to be his soft landing, but they were anything but peaceful. Each file was a whisper from the dead, a constant reminder of unfinished stories. He was only months from retirement, and yet peace still felt like a concept he'd never met. When his pager buzzed violently against his hip, it startled him. Nobody paged him anymore. He stepped out into the sterile hallway of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Columbus headquarters and dialed the number. "Dispatch, Detective Vance." The voice on the other end was brisk. "Detective, we have a priority notification from the Columbus BMV. A vehicle linked to one of your flagged cases just surfaced at a storage facility." Elias pulled out his notepad. "Which case?" The dispatcher hesitated. "Sasaki, Hana, case number 9500834. For a moment, Elias forgot how to breathe. That name hadn't crossed his lips in years, but it had never left his mind. "Detective, you still there?" "Yeah," he rasped. "Give me the address." He hung up before she could finish the details. The seminar, the pension, the talk of the future, all of it vanished. The only thing that mattered now was that name. Hana Sasaki. The case that broke him. The one that taught him that sometimes monsters didn't hide in alleys. They hid in ordinary lives. Back in 1995, she had been 21, a brilliant architecture student at Ohio State, full of color and promise. One Tuesday night in October, she'd stayed late at the studio, finishing her final model. Witnesses saw her leave, heading toward the parking lot with her blueprints tucked under her arm. The drive home should have taken 10 minutes. She never made it. For years, her case haunted every corner of his mind. And now, after more than a decade of silence, she was back. Not as a person, but as a car, sealed in dust and secrets, waiting for someone to finally open the door. When Hana Sasaki failed to show up for her major design presentation the next morning, her friends immediately knew something was wrong. By noon, the report had been filed. Within 24 hours, the search for the bright 21-year-old architecture student consumed the entire city of Columbus. Detective Elias Vance and his team combed through every inch of the route she would have taken home that night. They dredged the Olentangy River, scoured parking lots, and knocked on countless doors. Her professors described her as focused and kind. Her friends swore she had no enemies. There were no jealous exes, no disputes, no shadows in her life that hinted at trouble. It was as if the night itself had swallowed her whole. Eventually, the media and even his own department began to settle on the most painful explanation: a random abduction. Wrong place, wrong time. But there was one detail Elias could never reconcile: Hannah's beloved turquoise Volkswagen Beetle. The car had vanished with her, and abductors rarely went through the trouble of making a car disappear too. Now, 11 years later, that same car sat in a storage unit on Commerce Drive, covered in dust and secrets. Elias descended into the evidence archives, a cold, humming basement lined with rows of gray metal shelves. The air smelled of cardboard and time. He found the worn boxes labeled Sasaki H and carried the primary file to his desk. On top was her university ID. Hannah smiling into the camera, dark shoulder-length hair, pink sweater with a big green H stitched across the front. That photo still had the power to gut him. He remembered her parents standing in his office all those years ago, faces hollow from sleepless nights, begging him to find their daughter. He had promised them he would. It was a promise that never stopped haunting him. He flipped through the brittle pages, witness statements, timelines, grainy photos of parking lots long since repaved. Every word was a wound he'd reopened countless times. But now, the case wasn't cold anymore. He grabbed his coat and went straight to Captain Mendoza's office. Mendoza glanced up from his paperwork. "Elias, I thought you were in that retirement seminar." Elias didn't sit. "Hana Sasaki's car just turned up," he said flatly. Mendoza froze, the color draining slightly from his face. He and Elias had worked that case together back in '95. "Where?" "Commerce Drive, found during a storage auction." "I'll assign a team." "No," Elias cut in. "It's mine." His tone left no room for debate. Mendoza studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But be careful, Elias. Ghosts have a way of following the ones who chase them." Elias drove in silence, the rain-slicked streets of Columbus blurring past as if time itself was folding backward. 11 years gone, but it felt like yesterday. The U.S. storage facility was exactly as he imagined. Gray, lifeless, rows of identical metal doors holding forgotten things people didn't want to face. He flashed his badge at the patrol officer stationed at the gate. "Where is it?" "Row D, Unit 418, the officer replied. "The guy who found it's still here, shaken up." Elias followed the narrow aisle until he saw the open unit. There it was, the turquoise Beetle, dulled by time but unmistakable. Seeing it in person sent a jolt through him. He'd studied photos of this car until he could have drawn it from memory. Now it stood before him, real and heavy with the weight of everything it represented. A young man leaned against the wall nearby, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, grease on his jeans, nerves written all over his face. Elias approached. "Mr. Oles?" The man straightened. "Yeah, Jarek. Are you the detective?" "Detective Elias Vance, BCI Cold Case Unit." Elias gestured toward the open unit. "You bought this today?" "Yeah. Blind bid," Jarek said, his voice shaking slightly. "I restore classic Volkswagens. I saw the shape under the tarp and took a chance. I didn't know. I just called the BMV to check the van, and next thing I know, cops are on the way." Elias gave him a small nod. "You did the right thing, Mr. Oles. Sometimes, doing the right thing means waking up ghosts we thought were long gone. Is this conversation helpful so far?" Elias crouched beside the turquoise Beetle, his breath fogging in the frigid air as he studied every inch of it. He didn't need to touch it to know. The car confirmed what his gut had told him 11 years ago. There were no shattered windows, no dents, no signs of panic or violence. This wasn't a car abandoned in chaos. It had been parked deliberately, positioned with care, and covered to be forgotten. Whoever did this wasn't running. They were planning. "You said you restore these cars?" he asked, glancing over at Jarek, who stood just outside the tape line, anxious but curious. "Yeah," Jarek replied. "Been specializing in Volkswagens for years. My shop's right down the road." Elias motioned toward the car. "Then tell me, what do you see?" Jarek stepped closer, studying the vehicle with the quiet reverence of a craftsman. "For starters, it's been sitting here a long time. You can tell by the way the tires are flattened. They've been under the same pressure points for years. And the rust patterns?" He pointed toward the fenders. "That's not outdoor rust. It's the kind you get from damp, stale air. A closed space, like this storage unit." Elias watched as Jarek carefully used the end of a pen to nudge the driver's door open. The hinges creaked softly. "Interior's clean," Jarek murmured, shining his flashlight inside. "Dusty, but there's no trash, no food wrappers. Nobody lived in this. Whoever left it wasn't in a hurry. They planned for it to stay untouched." He motioned toward the rear. "I can't open the engine cover without tools, but I'd bet the battery's disconnected." "Why?" Elias asked. "That's what you do when you store a car long-term," Jarek explained. "You disconnect the battery so it doesn't corrode or drain. Whoever parked this wanted it to sleep." Elias nodded slowly. That one word, sleep, felt right. This wasn't disposal. It was erasure. Minutes later, the hum of engines signaled the arrival of the forensic team. Their van's headlights washed the rows of units in a sterile glow. Dr. Lena Hansen stepped out, clipboard in hand, her breath visible in the cold. "We'll start with full documentation," she said, already directing her team. Cameras clicked, flashes strobed, and the air filled with the soft murmur of professionals dissecting a mystery. "Every fiber, every print, every trace," Elias told her. "Treat this like a time capsule." Lena gave a weary nod. "We'll try, Elias. But 11 years in an uncontrolled environment? Dust, humidity, rodents. It's not kind to evidence." Elias knew that. Still, he couldn't afford cynicism. Not now. This car was the first tangible piece of Hannah's story in over a decade. It had survived for a reason. Once the photos were done, Elias oversaw the logistics of transport. The Beetle couldn't be driven, not safely. A flatbed was called in, and the process of loading it felt almost ceremonial, slow, deliberate, reverent. Jarek stood off to the side, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the car disappear into the night. "I'll need your statement," Elias told him. "You did the right thing coming forward." Jarek gave a small, uneasy smile. I hope you find out what happened to her. It doesn't feel right finding it like that. Feels like walking into someone's secret." Elias looked at the young man, so much like himself, years ago, before the job had hollowed him out. "You just did," he said quietly. When the truck's taillights vanished into the dark, Elias turned his focus to the next question. Who had rented this unit? The answer, he knew, could make or break everything. Inside the cramped facility office, Leonard Sykes, the manager, was chain-smoking by the open door, his nerves unraveling with every drag. "I need rental records for Unit 418, Elias said, sitting across from him at a cluttered desk. Sykes nodded quickly, stubbed out his cigarette, and pulled a thick, dust-caked ledger from a filing cabinet. "We switched to computers about 5 years back," he said, flipping through brittle pages, "but older stuff's still in here." His fingers stopped midway down a line. "Here it is. Rented October 28th, 1995. Elias froze. 3 days after Hannah disappeared. Whoever took her hadn't wasted time. They'd moved fast, efficient, intentional. "Who's the renter?" he asked, leaning forward. Sykes squinted at the faded handwriting. "Name listed is Robert Foster." The sound of it hung in the stale air like a warning bell. Elias had never seen the name before, but deep down, something in him whispered that he was about to. Elias already knew the name Robert Foster was a ghost, a placeholder, an alias created for one purpose: to disappear. Still, protocol demanded he run it. The database search returned exactly what he expected. Nothing. No record matching the name, the address, or the phone number. The address listed on the rental agreement wasn't even a residence, just a cracked, overgrown lot on the edge of a derelict neighborhood. "How was it paid for?" Elias asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sykes flipped back through the brittle pages of the ledger. "Cash," he said. "Prepaid, for 10 years. Elias blinked. 10? "Yeah," Sykes nodded, almost apologetically. "All up front, in cash. It was weird, even then, but the money was real, and we didn't ask questions." Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the stained ceiling tiles. 10 years prepaid in cash. No bank trail, no checks, no contact information that would ever be verified. Whoever did this hadn't just hidden a car. They'd purchased anonymity. They'd bought 10 years of silence. "Then why now?" Elias asked. "Why did the unit go up for auction?" Sykes rubbed the back of his neck. "The lease ran out last year, 2005. When it expired, it automatically switched to monthly billing. We sent invoices to the address on file. They came back undeliverable. Tried the phone number too. Disconnected. No payments after that." "So it defaulted," Elias murmured. "Exactly. 6 months later, it went into auction. Totally by the book. We just assumed the guy died or skipped town. We never opened it. Policy says we can't." Elias exhaled through his nose. The perpetrator hadn't made a mistake. The system had simply outlived their plan. They'd assumed 10 years was long enough, that the case would fade, that Hannah's name would vanish from memory. What they hadn't counted on was bureaucracy. When Elias returned to the now empty storage unit, the Beetle was gone, loaded hours ago onto the transport truck. Only the detritus remained. A few boxes of meaningless clutter, warped furniture, a collection of cheap, generic junk. The forensic team combed through it all, but there was nothing. No prints, no hair, no paper trail. Just silence and dust. The filler items were deliberate, Elias realized. Camouflage. Whoever rented the unit wanted it to look forgettable, unremarkable. Just another storage locker lost to time. He stood there for a long moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The air smelled of rust and old cardboard. Every detail of the place felt intentional, sterile, erased. The person who did this hadn't just taken Hannah. They'd removed her from the record. Back at Bureau headquarters, the fluorescent sterility followed him. He had a fake name, a prepaid lease, and a car buried in dust. Nothing that would hold up in court, but enough to prove one thing. Hannah's disappearance wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Now, the turquoise Beetle sat under floodlights in the State Crime Lab's impound facility, sealed behind glass and plastic sheeting. The air smelled of solvents and ozone. Elias stood beside Dr. Hansen and her team as they began processing. He'd seen hundreds of cars come through forensic bays, but never one that felt like this. A time capsule of a vanished life. The process was slow, methodical. The exterior was photographed under UV, IR, and oblique lighting. Every fleck of rust, every scratch pattern, every inch of paint was documented. Technicians took samples from the wheel wells and undercarriage, searching for soil or plant residue, anything that might reveal where it had been before it was entombed. The tires were deflated, removed, and swabbed. Microscopic particles were lifted from the treads. Then the focus shifted inside. The Beetle's interior was divided into a grid system, each section vacuumed and sealed in labeled evidence bags. Upholstery samples were taken for fiber and DNA testing. The steering wheel, gear shift, and dashboard were dusted and swabbed for latent prints. Even the seat tracks were checked for hair or thread. Elias hovered behind them, restless, tense. Every sound, the hiss of the air compressor, the soft scrape of gloves on vinyl, felt amplified. He watched, waiting for something, anything to emerge from the silence of that car. The room was bright and sterile, but Elias felt the shadows pressing in. This car was a tomb, he thought. A grave sealed not with earth, but with intention. And somewhere out there, the person who buried it was still living their life, calm, patient, confident that they'd buried their secret forever. They were wrong. Elias wasn't going to let this one die again. Cut to Jarek, the mechanic who couldn't let go. Jarek couldn't get the turquoise beetle out of his mind. At first, it was just frustration. The car he'd thought would change his business had turned out to be a police impound linked to a missing persons case. But as the days passed, that frustration turned into something else. Obsession. He'd seen the woman's face in the old photos online. Hana Sasaki. Bright, young, full of life. The kind of person who left an echo in everything she touched. He spent nights scrolling through old newspaper archives, archived forums, even cold case discussion boards. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he felt guilty for finding it. Maybe because he needed to understand why someone would bury a car like that, and why it still felt wrong. His small restoration shop, usually humming with music and the smell of oil and lacquer, felt empty now. Every beetle, every bus, every Carmen Gia he worked on reminded him of that one, the turquoise ghost. He kept replaying what he'd seen. The way the tires had settled perfectly flat, the rust forming in symmetrical blooms, the disconnected battery terminals polished clean. Whoever parked that car had done it deliberately, and as much as he respected the detectives, he knew they didn't think like mechanics. They saw the car as evidence. He saw it as a machine with a memory. Old Volkswagens had secrets, hidden, cavities behind the dash, hollow spaces in the chassis, spots no one would ever think to check. He started to wonder, what if the car still had something left to say? Would you like me to continue with the next part? Where Elias contacts Jarek and the two begin uncovering what the forensic team missed, leading to the discovery of a hidden compartment or clue inside the car. That's the ideal next episode beat, and I can script it in full cinematic form, complete with dialogue, tone, and pacing for YouTube narration. Within the hour, the evidence was sealed and transported to the state crime lab, but Elias couldn't shake the rush in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. That small motel key could be the first real thread in unraveling what happened to Hana Sasaki. He ordered his team to run a cross-check on Silver Pines, expecting it to be one of the hundreds of cheap roadside motels scattered across the state. The results came back quickly. There had been a Silver Pines motor lodge just outside of Ravenwood, a quiet mountain town about 2 hours north, but it had shut down 9 years ago after a fire destroyed part of the property. No one had ever linked it to the case. Elias stared at the address, a flicker of something, excitement or dread, tightening in his stomach. He called Jarek back into his office. "You've done more in one afternoon than we managed in 11 years, Elias said quietly. Jarek looked uneasy, unsure if that was a compliment or an omen. "So, what now?" he asked. Elias tapped the motel address on the printout. "Now we go there." The next morning, the two men drove through winding roads lined with bare trees and mist. The Silver Pines ruins emerged from the fog like a ghost, half-collapsed cabins, blackened timber, and weeds breaking through cracked asphalt. A faded sign still hung crookedly at the entrance, the word vacancy, missing most of its letters. As they stepped out of the car, the air was heavy with the scent of rain and rust. Jarek glanced around, scanning the overgrown lot. "It's been dead a long time," he murmured. Elias nodded, flashlight in hand. "So was the trail," he said grimly, "until you found that key." They pushed into what was left of the main office, the air stale and quiet except for the creak of their boots. Dust coated the floor in a thick layer, and their lights caught glimpses of burned furniture, charred papers, and forgotten remnants of someone's life. In the back room, Elias found the old key wall. Most of the hooks were empty, but one caught his attention. Faded numbers marked the rows, and right where room 24 should have been, the hook was bare. He exchanged a glance with Jarek. "Oct 24, Elias whispered, repeating the note from the paper. Room 24. They followed the cracked path leading to a line of decaying cabins, their windows shattered, their doors hanging loose. When they reached room 24, the number plate was missing, but the frame of the door still bore faint scorch marks. Jarek knelt and inspected the lock, comparing it to the key tag. "Same make," he said. "This key fits here." He slid it in gently. It turned with a dry metallic click. Elias held his breath as the door groaned open. The room inside was dark, the smell of mildew and something faintly chemical drifting out. The flashlight beam cut across peeling wallpaper, a rusted bed frame, and a collapsed dresser. For a moment, it seemed like just another ruin. But then Jarek's light caught something behind the wall panel, a narrow seam where the wallpaper bubbled unnaturally. He stepped closer, running his hand along the plaster. "This section's hollow," he said quietly. Elias handed him a small pry bar. The panel came loose with a dull crack, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a suitcase. Inside, wrapped in brittle plastic, was an old camera and a bundle of film reels. Elias stared at them, his pulse racing. "Hannah was a film student," he whispered. "She carried a camera everywhere." Jarek swallowed hard. "Then this might be hers." For the first time in over a decade, Elias felt something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The note was short, barely a sentence, but it hit him like a hammer. Evidence confirmed. That meant she had found something she wasn't supposed to, and Professor Croft. The name twisted in his memory like a ghost from the case files. "Croft," he murmured. "That's Dr. Alan Croft, her faculty advisor." Jarek frowned. He was involved in the case? Elias nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as he sifted through old recollections. He was questioned early on, but there was never enough to hold him. Claimed he hadn't seen her the night she disappeared. He said she missed their last meeting, that she stopped answering calls. He seemed genuinely shaken at the time. Elias stared down at the words again, his pulse racing. Meeting Professor Croft. 10 p.m. That was the night she vanished. He looked up at Jarek, his expression grim. "We just found the last appointment Hannah ever made." Jarek leaned on the table, studying the delicate handwriting. "If she wrote this right before she disappeared, it means she knew something worth hiding." Elias nodded. "And she hid it in the only place she thought no one would look: her car." The weight of the revelation settled heavily between them. For the first time in years, Elias had a name. Not an alias, not a dead lead, but a real person tied directly to the night Hannah vanished. He grabbed his phone, dialing the BCI archive desk. "This is Detective Elias Vance. I need all records on Dr. Alan Croft. Faculty files, financials, disciplinary reports, the works. Pull his address history, too." Jarek watched him pace, the detective's energy electric, alive again after years of dormancy. "You think he's still around?" Elias exhaled sharply. "If he is, he's about to get a visit." Within an hour, the records came through. Croft had retired in 2002, shortly after the investigation fizzled out. He'd moved north to a lakeside town called Fairhaven, quiet, isolated, the kind of place people go to disappear. Elias printed the address and looked at Jarek. "You've come this far. You want to finish it?" Jarek hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I need to know what happened to her." The next morning, they drove to Fairhaven. The air was crisp, the roads winding through thick pine forests. As they neared the lake, the fog rolled low over the water, muffling the world in gray. Croft's house sat on a slope above the shoreline, a small cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush. A for sale sign leaned crookedly near the fence, the paint on it peeling. Elias parked the car and shut off the engine. "Stay close," he said quietly. They approached the door, which hung slightly ajar. No lights inside. Elias knocked once, twice. "Dr. Croft, this is Detective Elias Vance, Bureau of Criminal Investigation." Silence. He pushed the door open. The cabin smelled of old wood, mold, and dust. The furniture was sparse. A single table, books stacked high, a wall of filing cabinets. But something about the scene felt wrong. The air was stale, undisturbed. Elias moved cautiously through the narrow hallway, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. Jarek followed behind, scanning the walls. In the back room, they found him. Dr. Alan Croft sat slumped at his desk, his skin pale, skeletal. A revolver rested on the table beside him. He'd been dead for some time, weeks, maybe months. Papers were scattered around him, drawings, letters, faded photographs. Elias's eyes caught a single envelope, yellowed with age, resting near Croft's hand. On the front, written in trembling script, were 2 words: "For Hannah." Elias stared at it, his chest tightening. Jarek swallowed hard. What is that?" Elias reached for the envelope carefully, his gloves brushing the brittle paper. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's her last message, or his confession." He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "I never meant for it to go this far. She found out about the tests, the funding, the cover-ups. She said she had proof. I begged her not to go public. She wouldn't listen. It wasn't supposed to happen that night. I just wanted to scare her. But things got out of control. I hid the car. I thought it would all disappear with time, but I see her face every night. Forgive me." Elias lowered the letter slowly. The only sound was the soft hum of the wind outside the cabin. Jarek looked pale. "He killed her," he whispered. "All this time?" Elias nodded, jaw tightening. "And now the bastard escaped justice the easy way." He folded the letter, sealing it in an evidence bag. For the first time in 11 years, the story had an ending, but not the kind either of them had hoped for. Jarek looked at the lake through the window, the fog curling over the still water. "Do you think she ever knew he'd confess?" Elias shook his head. "No, but maybe now she can finally rest." He turned to the door, pausing for one last look at the lonely cabin. The case that had haunted him for over a decade was finally closed, not by the system, not by chance, but by the quiet persistence of 2 men who refused to stop looking. Outside, as they walked back to the car, the morning light broke through the fog, glinting off the turquoise Beetle parked in the distance. And for the first time, Elias didn't see a ghost. He saw closure. Elias pulled Hannah's blueprints closer, his fingers trembling as he laid them side by side with the architectural plans for the Aegis Tower. Every line, every curve, every impossible sweep of glass and steel. It was all there. The same vision, the same brilliance, down to the smallest, most intricate detail. Hannah's design hadn't just inspired Croft's masterpiece. It was the Aegis Tower. She had created it, and he had stolen it. The room felt colder suddenly, the hum of the overhead light almost unbearable in the silence that followed. Jarek stepped closer, staring at the overlapping drawings. "My God," he whispered. "He built her dream. He built it and buried her with it." Elias nodded slowly, his throat tight with fury and disbelief. "He killed her to take it," he said, "and he's been standing on her grave ever since." That night, Elias sat alone in his office, the city lights glimmering outside the rain-streaked windows. Every article, every photo of Croft accepting another award, smiling for another magazine spread. It all looked different now. The charm, the brilliance, the warmth. It was performance. A mask. Behind it stood a man who had murdered a student for the one thing he couldn't create himself: genius. Elias's computer chimed. A background check from the database had finished running. Recent property acquisitions, travel records. And then, buried deep in a line of transactions, something caught his eye. Silver Pines Lodge, registered to a Croft-owned trust. His breath hitched. The motel key they'd found in the car. It wasn't just a clue. It was a map. By dawn, Elias and Jarek were speeding through the rain-soaked roads toward the outskirts of the city. Silver Pines sat on the edge of an abandoned highway, surrounded by overgrown pines and rusting signs from a forgotten era. As they approached, the building emerged through the mist. Faded paint, cracked windows, the faint hum of a generator still keeping one office light alive. Elias pushed open the office door. The air inside smelled of mildew and something older, dust, paper, decay. The register on the counter was still there, its pages warped with moisture. He flipped through until he found it. October 24th, 1995, Room 7, registered to J. Croft. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. The door creaked open easily, the lock long broken. Inside, the air felt trapped in time. A single chair, a broken lamp, wallpaper curling off the walls. But under the floorboards, Jarek found something wrapped in plastic, meticulously sealed. Inside was a strip of negatives. Hannah, smiling, standing in front of the unfinished Aegis model, holding the same blueprints Elias now kept locked in evidence. Elias stared down at her frozen smile, realization and grief warring inside him. She had found out. She'd confronted Croft here, at this motel, maybe threatening to expose him, and he'd silenced her. When they stepped outside, the first rays of daylight cut through the mist, turning the motel sign into a faint silhouette of red and gold. Elias clenched the evidence bag in his hand. He built his empire on her brilliance, he said quietly. Now we're going to tear it down. Back in Columbus, the war had already begun. Croft's face filled every screen, his team scrambling to manage the rumors leaking from the reopened case. But Elias wasn't playing by their rules anymore. He had Hannah's proof, her final confrontation immortalized in design and film. And this time, the truth wasn't going to vanish. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about resurrection. Hannah's voice, silenced for 11 years, was finally about to be heard. Elias hung up the phone, his pulse thrumming with a mix of triumph and dread. For the first time, the timeline no longer felt like a cold record. It was alive, breathing, pointing straight at Croft. The airtight alibi that had shielded him for more than a decade had just cracked open. Julian Croft had left the dinner at 9 sharp. Hannah had vanished around 10, and between those 60 minutes lay the truth he'd been chasing for 11 years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall where photos, blueprints, and timelines now formed a chaotic collage of obsession. The patterns were all there now. Stolen designs, a silenced student, a falsified alibi. Croft hadn't just built buildings. He'd built lies, each one carefully layered to hide the foundation of his crime. Elias knew this wasn't enough to take to court. Suspicion could open doors, but only proof could burn them down. He needed to place Croft at Silver Pines that night to connect him directly to Hannah's disappearance. The motel was long abandoned, but maybe, just maybe, time hadn't erased everything. He called Jarek. "We're going back," he said. They drove through the night, headlights cutting through sheets of rain, the road to Silver Pines twisting through the fog like a ghost's path. When they arrived, the sky was bruised with storm clouds. Elias and Jarek slipped inside, flashlights sweeping over the decayed hallway where wallpaper hung in strips. They retraced their steps to Room 7, the place where Hannah's confrontation had likely turned fatal. This time, Elias examined every inch. Beneath the rotted carpet near the wall heater, his flashlight caught a glint of metal. He knelt, pried up the warped floorboard, and froze. There, embedded in the dust, was a tarnished cufflink engraved with a single initial, J.C. His breath hitched. Croft had been here. The room still carried the ghost of his arrogance. Jarek bagged the cufflink carefully. DNA, prints, metal composition. We'll run everything, he said, his voice low but electric with adrenaline. Elias nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The evidence, the motive, the timeline, it was all aligning. Croft's empire wasn't untouchable anymore. Its foundation was about to crumble. Back in Columbus, Elias prepared the report for the district attorney's office, attaching Dr. Thorne's analysis, the corroborating testimony from Dr. Reed, and the newly recovered cufflink. As he compiled the files, a single phrase from Hannah's note echoed in his mind: final confrontation. He realized it wasn't just Hannah's last stand. It was about to become his. Julian Croft had spent years hiding behind fame, power, and philanthropy. But beneath the gleaming towers and magazine covers, Elias could now see him for what he truly was: a thief who mistook brilliance for something he could steal, a man who believed he could bury the truth forever. Now, Elias was ready to prove him wrong. The confrontation Hannah had started would finally be finished, and this time, the world would be watching. Sarah set the teacup down, her fingers trembling slightly as if touching a wound that had never healed. She started to seem afraid, she said quietly. Not paranoid, just cautious. She stopped staying late at the studio unless someone else was there. She told me Croft wasn't the man people thought he was. She didn't say more, but one night I heard her crying in her room. She said something like, "He took everything." When I tried to ask what she meant, she just shook her head and said it would all make sense soon. Elias leaned forward, his voice soft but urgent. Did she ever mention where she planned to meet him that night? Sarah nodded slowly. She said she was going to confront him. She called it her final review. I thought she meant a project critique. If I'd known... Her voice broke. Elias placed a reassuring hand on the table. You couldn't have known. As he drove back from Cleveland, the weight of the truth pressed down harder than ever. The pieces fit too perfectly now. Croft's false alibi, the construction site, Hannah's final message, and the mud and concrete dust on his clothes. Elias gripped the steering wheel tighter as a sickening realization solidified in his mind. The Aegis Tower wasn't just built on stolen ideas, it was built over a grave. If Croft had disposed of Hannah's body in the foundation, then every inch of that skyscraper was a monument to his crime. He contacted the city's public works department, requesting the original construction logs for the Aegis Tower. The files were massive, but Elias combed through them meticulously. The deep foundation was poured the night of October 10th, 1995, the same night Hannah vanished. He found a notation written by the site foreman. Unexpected delay. Rebar placement adjusted after inspection. It was small, easy to overlook, but to Elias it screamed of manipulation. Something, or someone, had been buried before the concrete was sealed forever. Armed with this revelation, Elias reached out to a forensic excavation specialist from the State Crime Lab. Convincing them to investigate the base of a landmark skyscraper was nearly impossible. But Elias's persistence and the mounting evidence finally earned him limited permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans beneath the tower's substructure. The results came in 2 days later. Beneath the reinforced concrete slab, in a section marked Adjusted Rebar Placement, the radar picked up an anomaly, a hollow void roughly the size of a human body. Elias stood in the basement of the Aegis Tower, staring at the scanning equipment as the image appeared on the monitor. His throat went dry. After 11 years, Hannah Sasaki was about to be found. The air felt heavier, charged with a silent kind of justice long overdue. "Get the forensic team," Elias said quietly. "We're opening it up." As the drills roared to life, Elias closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Hannah's charcoal sketches, her dreams of redefining architecture, her determination to stand up for her work. The girl who had built a future out of imagination had been buried beneath the monument of her own stolen genius. But not anymore. The truth was rising from the concrete, and with it, the empire Julian Croft had built on lies was about to collapse, piece by piece, floor by floor. The next morning, Elias's access to the case files was restricted. His supervisor called him into the office, delivering the news with a mix of apology and fear. "Orders from above," he said quietly. "You're being reassigned, effective immediately." Elias didn't need to ask who above meant. Croft's reach was everywhere. He walked out of the precinct with a sickening weight of injustice in his gut. 11 years of silence, and now, when the truth was finally within reach, the system was folding to power once again. But Elias wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He spent that night in his apartment surrounded by files, photographs, and the rolled blueprints that had reignited the investigation. Croft had buried Hannah's body in concrete. Now the city itself was bearing the truth. He stared at the architectural renderings of the Aegis Tower glowing on his screen. The twisting glass structure gleamed like a blade against the sky, a monument to theft and murder. Hannah's ghost lived inside that building, and Elias swore he would bring her out, no matter what it cost. He reached out to Jarek Oles, the mechanic who had found the car. "They shut it down," Elias said over the phone. "The DA won't touch it." Jarek's voice was tense. "Then we go around them. You said you have the site records, right? The exact foundation coordinates." Elias hesitated. "You're not suggesting—" "You know I am," Jarek interrupted. "We don't need a warrant to look. If we can prove there's something buried there, they won't be able to ignore it." Elias felt the danger in the idea, but also the pull of truth. The kind of truth that demanded breaking rules to set it free. That night, long after midnight, the two men met at the Aegis Tower. The streets were empty, the skyline glowing under a cold moon. They entered through a service access Jarek had managed to open. The hum of machinery echoed through the basement, where the lowest sublevels met the foundation. Elias's flashlight beam cut across the massive concrete pillars, each one a silent tomb of steel and stone. "Right here," Jarek whispered, pointing to a column marked in the old blueprints, the same one noted for adjusted rebar placement. Jarek unpacked a small industrial drill and a portable ground-penetrating sensor. The sound of the drill was deafening in the empty space. Dust filled the air, swirling in the beam of their lights. Elias's pulse raced. Every sound felt amplified, dangerous. They were trespassing in the heart of a billionaire's empire. After several tense minutes, Jarek stopped drilling. "Got it," he said, attaching the sensor to the surface. The monitor flickered to life, scanning the dense concrete. Then a sudden break in the image appeared. A void, just as before, but this time, deeper and more defined. Elias leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's her." His throat tightened. The weight of 11 years pressed down on him. He pulled out his camera and began recording. "Detective Elias Vance," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Documenting evidence of human remains beneath the Aegis Tower Foundation. Support column C12. This footage will be sent to the State Crime Division immediately." Jarek exhaled shakily. "You just signed both our death warrants." Elias turned to him, his eyes fierce. "No, we just opened hers." As they packed up, distant footsteps echoed down the corridor. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. Elias killed the flashlight. The air turned electric with dread. Someone else was down there. They exchanged a glance, the same unspoken realization running between them. Croft knew. The empire of lies was about to crack, and the man who built it was not going to let it fall quietly. They moved like shadows through the service corridors, breath shallow, duffels heavy with illicit hope. Jarek hauled the GPR cart while Elias kept a low, aching ache of impatience coiled in his chest. And when they reached the area beneath column C12, where the old logs and the radar anomaly had both pointed, Jarek wheeled the unit into place and set it humming, the screen painting the concrete in ghostly cross-sections until there it was again. A dark, bone-shaped void where no void should exist. A hollow the size and shape of a person, layered where the rebar adjustment had been logged. Adrenaline turned their hands into instruments of single-minded precision. Jarek drilled a narrow access bore while Elias watched the dust fall like a slow confession. And when the drill finally punched through the outer skin of concrete, a thin, brittle powder spilled into the light, and something that looked alarmingly like fabric fibers fluttered into the beam. Jarek scraped, fingers raw, and revealed the edge of a small, rusted metal tag. Then bone. Small, calcified, unmistakable. And Elias felt the world tilt. The justice he'd chased for 11 years suddenly within reach. But the night that had been theirs for a moment folded into chaos as a security alarm they'd somehow missed began to wail. Lights strobed, and the echoing footfalls of guards closed in. They packed the exposed evidence into an evidence bag, Jarek already filming on his phone as Elias barked orders into a shaky phone to Maria Sanchez, who promised backup without asking questions. Men in suits and badges poured into the sub-level. First security, then building management, then, impossibly, a squad car whose lights painted the concrete blue. And then Croft arrived, not as a defeated man, but flanked by a small army of attorneys and a media liaison. His face a mask of cultivated outrage as he demanded to know what those two ragged trespassers had done to his property, his voice honeyed with menace. Elias stepped forward, clutching the zipped evidence bag, and for the first time he did not plead. He presented the blueprints, Dr. Thorne's analysis on his tablet, the motel negatives, the motel key, Jarek's footage of the hidden packet, and now the GPR readout and the fragments pulled from the void, all threaded together into a tight, public narrative that no lawyer could easily smother. Croft's eyes darted from the bones to the plans, and for an instant something like a man who had been unmasked trembled. His counsel snarled threats about injunctions and defamation, but the forensic techs Maria had quietly routed to the site stepped forward with chain of custody forms and the protocol to secure the scene, and Captain Mendoza, who had been dragged there by rumors and the sudden media attention Jarek's streaming had sparked, pushed through the crowd with a warrant hand delivered by a DA who, under public pressure and the weight of physical evidence, had finally allowed an emergency excavation. Croft tried to bargain, to charm, to buy time, his practiced persona cracking as reporters pressed microphones forward. But when the forensics chief announced formal identification procedures and the intent to recover remains, that facade broke into something raw and animal. Defiance, then pleading, then the small private panic of a man who realizes the scaffolding of his life is aflame. Elias watched him flinch, felt the long years of denial tilt toward closure, and as the first careful official removal of material from the column began under lights and with every legal safeguard in place, he allowed himself, for the first time since Hannah vanished, a steady, exhausted exhale. The final confrontation had not been a courtroom monologue or a shouted confession in a dark motel, but this quieter, crueler spectacle, a dignified structure stripped of its saint and revealed to be built on a lie. And tonight, amid dust and flashing cameras and the low, professional voices of forensics cataloging history, Julian Croft's empire began to fracture under the simple weight of truth. The stairwell exploded with light as the door was thrown open and a pair of security guards flooded in, flashlights stabbing through the dark. Elias instinctively shoved Jarek behind him and raised his hands, breath ragged, voice steadying into command. "We're law enforcement. BCI, warrant pending. We found human remains in column C6. The guards barked orders, weapons trained, suspicion written across their faces. But before the situation could calcify into cuffs and accusations, a second set of boots thundered down the stairs. Maria Sanchez, breathing hard, flanked by two plainclothes officers from the organized crime unit Elias had called. And behind them, one of the DA's investigators Maria had begged for a favor. Maria pushed forward, sliding a laptop and a stack of printed chain of custody forms across Elias's outstretched hand as if proving legitimacy could be done with paper and will. And Elias, voice clipped, began reciting the timeline. GPR readout, motel negatives, the motel key, the hidden packet, Dr. Thorne's analysis. and he played Jarek's phone footage of the cavity and the packet for the nearest guard until the room went quiet in that particular way. Truth makes silence. The security team radioed up the chain. Building management demanded IDs, and within minutes the subterranean level became a controlled crime scene. Ropes, evidence tags, and sworn officers replacing unarmed guards. News vans, summoned by Jarek's live feed that had been rebroadcast by an eager blogger, began to arrive above ground. Within an hour, flashing cameras and reporters crowded the plaza, while inside the tower the forensics crew, now officially on site, began a careful, legal extraction of material from the column under the watchful eyes of a DA representative who'd been compelled by the public storm. Croft appeared like a specter at the perimeter, suit immaculate, face carved into a practiced look of concern. Attorneys clustered at his elbow, but the tide had turned. The GPR image, the motel negatives, the key, the letter in Croft's own hand found in his dead professor's house, and the newly recovered fragments pulled from the void were no longer rumors to be silenced with threats. They were physical exhibits with timestamps, lab seals, and witnesses. Croft's counsel snarled about injunctions and reputations, tried to drown the narrative in legalese, but as the forensics chief announced the recovery of human remains and the preliminary dental and isotope tests matched Hannah's dental records and biological profile, the veneer of invincibility cracked. The cameras recorded Croft's mask slipping, first indignation, then a pale, animal panic. While Elias stood rigid, all the exhaustion of 11 years distilled into a single, terrible relief. Hannah's name echoed through the press line, and for the first time in over a decade, that name was tethered to evidence that would compel a prosecutor to act. The arrest warrants followed in short order, not because Elias had broken the rules in a moment of righteous recklessness, but because the rule of law finally met the weight of undeniable proof. Croft was taken into custody, his firm's steel and glass trophies already under subpoena, and as the column was carefully opened wider and more remains were recovered and catalogued, Elias allowed himself only one small, private gesture. He took out Hannah's brittle photograph, the one Jarek had found in the hidden packet, kissed its corner, and tucked it into his coat as if carrying her with him out of the concrete and back into the light. Eleanor Vance sat back in her chair, silent for a long moment. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space, underscoring the gravity of what she'd just heard. Her sharp eyes flicked from the GPR scan to Elias, assessing not just the evidence, but the man. "You realize what you're saying, Detective?" she said finally, her voice low, deliberate. "You're accusing one of the most powerful men in the state of murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice. If you're wrong, this will destroy your career, and possibly mine." Elias met her gaze without flinching. "I know, but if I'm right, and I am, then a murderer has been walking free for 11 years, living off the brilliance of the woman he buried in concrete." Eleanor didn't look away. She had spent decades navigating political storms, but this was different. It wasn't just corruption or corporate scandal. It was human. "And you obtained this evidence without a warrant?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Yes, unofficially, but everything I've presented can be verified. The GPR data, the timestamps, the chain of custody on the photographs. We just need authorization to excavate column C6. She exhaled slowly, then stood, pacing the room. "If we move on this, it has to be airtight. Croft's legal team will try to discredit you, suppress the evidence, smear every name attached to this case. Then make it public," Elias said. "If we do this quietly, they'll bury it again. We need to act before they can." Eleanor paused mid-step, studying him. There was fire in his voice, the weary kind that came from a man who had seen too much injustice and refused to let this one go. Finally, she nodded. "You'll get your excavation order," she said, "and I'll assign a federal observer to ensure the chain of evidence is preserved. If that column contains what you say it does, Julian Croft won't talk his way out of this. For the first time in years, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Real, tangible hope. By the following afternoon, the Aegis Tower Plaza was sealed off under an emergency state directive. Construction crews under federal supervision began breaking through the base of Column C6. Croft's attorneys were already filing injunctions demanding the work be halted, claiming malicious fabrication and destruction of private property. But the Attorney General's order held. The drilling started slow, precision cuts to avoid compromising the building's structure. Elias stood behind the perimeter tape, watching, every muscle in his body wound tight. Jarek stood beside him, filming the entire operation. Reporters had begun to gather, sensing the scale of what was unfolding. Hours passed. Then, one of the operators shouted. The drill had hit something. Not rebar, not concrete. Something softer. The crew switched to hand tools. Dust and silence filled the air. The lead technician reached into the cavity and froze. When he turned, his gloved hand held a fragment of bone. The site erupted into motion. Forensic technicians rushed in, sealing the area, marking, photographing, extracting. Within the hour, skeletal remains were carefully removed, along with remnants of fabric, fibers that matched the pattern of clothing Hannah had been wearing the night she vanished. The GPR anomaly was no longer theory. It was truth. Elias felt his knees weaken. After 11 years, he had found her. The next morning, national headlines blazed. Body of missing architecture student found inside Aegis Tower Foundation. Famed professor under investigation. Julian Croft's empire collapsed overnight. His investors withdrew. His university severed all ties. And when DNA tests confirmed the remains belonged to Hana Sasaki, the Attorney General's office issued an arrest warrant. Elias was there when they took Croft in, standing on the steps of the courthouse as the man was led away in handcuffs. Croft's face was pale, his composure finally broken. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. She was brilliant, Elias said quietly. You just couldn't stand that she was better than you. Croft didn't reply. That night, Elias returned to the excavation site. The column had been sealed off, marked as a permanent memorial. A single light illuminated the spot where Hannah's remains had been found. He stood there for a long while, the city humming quietly above, the wind moving through the steel and glass she had once dreamed of building. She got her justice, Jarek said softly behind him. Elias nodded. No, he whispered, eyes fixed on the foundation. She earned it. Would you like me to write the epilogue scene next? The aftermath of Croft's trial, and how Elias's final days on the force unfold, for the emotional closing of the story and YouTube outro tone. He stood in silence, the sound of the machines fading behind him, replaced by the slow thrum of his own heartbeat. The jagged edge of the concrete column gaped like an open wound. The monument to Croft's success now revealed as a tomb built on theft and death. For years, Elias had imagined this moment, finding her, proving the truth, tearing down the lie that had stolen a young woman's future. But standing there now, surrounded by the smell of dust and concrete and the hum of floodlights, there was no triumph, only grief. He crouched near the column, his gloved hand brushing the rough concrete dust from his knee. You deserved better, Hannah, he whispered. You deserved to build the world you dreamed of. Jarek stood beside him, silent, the weight of the moment pressing on them both. The forensic team sealed the remains into a transport case, marking it with the evidence tag, Case 9524, Sasaki, Hana. As they carried it out, the last echoes of drilling and cutting died away, leaving the space eerily still. By dawn, the world knew. News anchors spoke in solemn tones as aerial footage of the Aegis Tower played on every network. The remains of missing architecture student Hana Sasaki have been discovered inside the foundation of the Aegis Tower. Professor Julian Croft, long celebrated as a visionary, is now under arrest for her murder and the theft of her work. The facade of greatness had crumbled. Croft was taken into custody by state agents at his penthouse. Cameras caught every second, the flash of cuffs, the shouting reporters, the stunned expression that flickered between disbelief and rage. "You can't prove anything," he barked, his voice cracking as they led him away. But the world had already seen enough. Inside the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, Elias watched the footage in silence. He didn't smile, didn't speak. Justice wasn't supposed to feel hollow, but it did, because beneath the concrete and lies, a life had still been stolen, a genius silenced before her time. Weeks later, the Attorney General's office announced the results of the forensic audit. Every cornerstone of Julian Croft's career traced back to stolen blueprints, falsified drafts, manipulated project files, all leading to Hana Sasaki. Her vision had defined his empire. In a press conference, Eleanor Vance spoke firmly before a crowd of cameras. For 11 years, this city admired a man who built monuments from another person's brilliance. Today, we honor the woman who created them, and we restore her name. Her words echoed across the state. Universities withdrew Croft's degrees, rescinded his awards, erased his name from plaques and buildings. In their place, a new dedication was announced, the Hana Sasaki Institute for Design Integrity. On the day of the memorial, Elias stood outside the Aegis Tower once more. A small plaque had been set into the plaza at the base of the building. In memory of Hana Sasaki, 1973 to 1995, architect, visionary, dreamer. Her brilliance lives in the skyline she never saw. The wind carried the low hum of traffic, the quiet rhythm of the city she had once dreamed of shaping. Elias watched as the morning light reflected off the tower's glass, no longer a monument to Croft, but a testament to the truth she'd left behind. Jarek joined him, hands in his pockets. "So, what happens now?" Elias exhaled slowly. "Now," he said, "I retire." He smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "But not because I'm done, because I can finally stop chasing ghosts." As he walked away from the tower, the city lights flickering against the morning sky, Elias felt something. Jarek stood in front of the turquoise Beetle, the same car that had once been buried in the shadows of the Aegis Tower, now gleaming under the afternoon sun. The dents had been repaired, the paint polished to a smooth shine, a resurrection of sorts. He ran his hand along the hood, his reflection glinting in the chrome. "She's free now," he said quietly. Elias nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah," he replied, "and so are we." For the first time in over a decade, Elias felt the steady rhythm of peace return. The ghosts of the case, the sleepless nights, the endless files, the haunting image of Hana's unfinished blueprints, finally began to fade. Justice had come late, but it had come, and for Hana Sasaki, the truth had been unearthed from the concrete that tried to silence her. The city moved on, though it would never forget. The Aegis Tower, once the crown jewel of Julian Croft's empire, had been stripped of his name. Now it bore a new one, the Hana Sasaki Memorial Building. Every morning sunlight danced across its glass facade, casting soft patterns over the memorial plaque at its base. Architects, students, and dreamers came to visit, not to worship a fraud, but to honor a visionary who never saw her dream completed. Croft, meanwhile, lived out his days behind steel bars. A man once worshipped for his genius, now remembered only for his greed. His empire, built on lies and blood, had collapsed entirely. The irony was cruel. The same foundations that had hidden his crime became the evidence that destroyed him. Elias visited the building one last time before retirement. The city's noise hummed around him. Car horns, chatter, the distant sound of construction. Life moving forward, as it always does. He stared up at the tower, his reflection flickering in its mirrored surface. Somewhere deep inside, he could almost hear Hana's laughter again, carried on the wind like a faint echo from another time. Jarek joined him, hands stained with grease, still smelling faintly of motor oil. "So what now, detective?" he asked. Elias smiled, his eyes tired but calm. "Now I rest," he said. "The city will have to chase its own ghosts for a while." Jarek laughed softly. "You know, if you ever get bored, I could use a partner at the shop." Elias chuckled, glancing at the turquoise beetle parked nearby. "I think I've had enough puzzles for one lifetime." They stood there for a moment, watching the sunset paint the city in hues of gold and rose. For the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of justice not as a burden, but as a promise kept. As the light faded, the camera of imagination would pull back, from the two men standing beneath the towering glass monument to the glittering skyline Hannah once dreamed of shaping. Her story, once buried beneath lies, had become the heartbeat of the city she loved. And in that stillness, as the credits of life quietly rolled on, one truth remained. Some legacies are built not in steel or stone, but in the courage to uncover them. The late afternoon light slanted through the glass of the Hana Sasaki Memorial Building, scattering across the marble floor like fragments of gold. Elias stood quietly, his hands in the pockets of a well-worn jacket, watching the soft glow ripple up the twisting steel beams above him. The place felt alive, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a promise that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the surface. He thought of Hannah, the young woman whose genius had once been stolen, whose life had been sealed beneath the concrete foundations of a lie. And yet, even in death, she had risen. Her designs now defined the skyline she once dreamed of shaping. Around him, the lobby buzzed with quiet admiration. Students sketching in notebooks, architects photographing details of the atrium, visitors pausing before the memorial plaque that bore her name. Her story had become legend, her voice immortalized in glass and steel. Elias smiled faintly. It was not the smile of victory, but of quiet gratitude. Justice had never been clean or easy. It was slow, imperfect, and heavy with loss. But it was worth every sleepless night, every unanswered question. He had spent 3 decades chasing ghosts, and for once, one of them had finally found peace. From the reflection of the glass, he saw a figure approach. A young woman, her backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes bright with determination. "Detective Vance?" she asked softly. He turned, chuckling. "Just Elias now." "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for what you did for Hannah, for showing us that truth still matters." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, he saw the spark of Hannah's brilliance in her eyes. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was her. She never stopped shining, even when the world tried to cover her up." The student nodded, moved beyond words. She lingered a moment longer, then drifted away, leaving Elias alone once more in the glow of the fading sun. He walked slowly toward the exit, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast space. Outside, the city hummed, cranes rising, foundations being poured, new dreams taking shape. Somewhere, Hannah's legacy lived on in every line drawn, every risk taken, every act of courage that defied silence. Elias paused at the edge of the plaza, gazing back one final time at the tower that bore her name. "Rest easy, Hannah," he murmured. "You're home now." And with that, he turned and walked into the city's heartbeat, an old detective, finally unburdened, leaving behind not a case, but a story that would outlive them all. In the end, the foundation of lies came crashing down. Justice was slow, but it came, carried by those who refused to stop searching for the truth. Hana Sasaki's brilliance lives on, not as a victim story, but as a symbol of what it means to be seen, heard, and remembered. Detective Elias Vance found peace not in the courtroom, but in the quiet knowledge that the truth had finally come home, and somewhere, above the city skyline, her legacy still shines. If this story moved you, share it, so Hannah's voice continues to echo far beyond the walls that once tried to silence her. Subscribe for more true stories where justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds the light.